my name is JD and this is my channel Frost and Forest. So today I am doing a video response to Jay at Iridescent Tarot. They recently did a hashtag that was hashtag only one deck. And so the idea of this VR is that basically if you could only have one tarot deck and one oracle deck that you would use for the rest of your life, what would they be? So I decided to torture myself this weekend by doing this challenge and trying to narrow it down to one tarot deck and one oracle deck. The other thing that Jay was very clear about in the VR, or in the video that I'm responding to, is that you can only show your top decks and a runner-up if you want to. But you can only show the runner-up if you talk about why it was not the top deck. So for me, in order to do this, I had to come up with a process for figuring out what this deck is, because just looking at my collection of a lot of different decks, it was going to be hard to just say, yep, that's the one. That's the one I would have for the rest of time. You know, that wouldn't really work for me. So I am going to talk you through a little bit my process for how I got to the one oracle deck and one tarot deck. And so hopefully that's not cheating too much. You might see some video of some of the decks I was thinking about as I was kind of going through my process. So hopefully that's not cheating too much, but let's get started. So the first thing that I thought about is, what are some of the things that are important to me in decks? Like, what is my deck aesthetics, you could say? And I would say that in general, there are, some categories of things or some characteristics of decks that are really important to me. The first thing is a cozy deck. I am very much a cozy person. I'm all about cozy decks. So, things like the Cottage Witch Oracle or things like the Cozy Witch Tarot, in general, I tend to like a cozy aesthetic. Then on the exact opposite end, I do tend to like dark, spooky decks that just are a little bit creepy and a little bit dark. I tend to like those as well. I definitely have a strong connection to nature, and so I really do love nature-y decks, especially nature that represents where I am. As well as, I do work with my decks seasonally, and so, I like decks that have the capacity to work seasonally, or else I'm just kind of, or else I switch out my decks seasonally. One of the things that I was thinking a lot about this is I do work with my decks very seasonally. So, this is not like a formal process where I have, okay, these are my spring decks, these are my winter decks. It's not like that, but I do tend to choose and am drawn to certain decks, depending on the time of year. So that was one of the biggest challenges that I was thinking about related to this, is that, what is one deck that helps me get that seasonality that is pretty important to me. So that was another thing I was thinking about. I tend to really like witchy decks that feel very witchy. Is just something is an aesthetic that I am attracted to, and so I do have a lot of decks that are quite witchy, and I love them. And then lastly, I do tend to be drawn to decks that have more women represented in them, especially decks that show strong women. That is a kind of the last theme that I find myself really attracted to. Some other things that I was thinking about is, for example, some practical considerations. If you're only keeping one deck for the rest of your life, you probably want a deck that you can shuffle. It would be pretty heartbreaking if the you only had one deck and it was a deck that you couldn't shuffle. Also, a good guidebook. If you're only going to have one deck, I could see having a really good guidebook being important, especially for the Oracle deck, just because, for me, I have a harder time working with Oracle decks just sort of intuitively. And so I do like Oracle decks that have a good guidebook. And then lastly, kind of related to Oracle decks is just, I would want an Oracle deck that has a number of different cards. If this is the only Oracle deck that you have, or that I have, I probably don't want it to be an Oracle deck that, only has 36 cards. That's not very many cards. That's not very many situations that it can cover. So those are kind of the categories or the things that I was thinking about in my brain as I was thinking about decks. Again, this was very hard. And so I needed a process to narrow this down, because for me, it was, it just wasn't going to work to just pick. That wasn't going to happen. So what I ended up doing for a process is I kind of picked, it's a lot easier to pick out your sort of top 10 decks. Basically, I took my top 10 decks and then I sort of pitted them against each other. So I would lay down one deck on one side and I just lay down cards, and then I would lay down another deck on the other side and just lay down cards. And then I would decide between those two decks. So which one of those two did I want to keep? And then I went through that with all 10 decks. The idea being basically the deck that is the final deck that's standing is the one that I picked. And so that's kind of how I was able to, really circle in on the deck that is the decks that I would keep if I could only keep one deck. So that's all my process. We're like 9 minutes in and I haven't even shown you all any cards. And Jay did say we could show the runners up. So instead of showing you the runners up, I'm going to actually show you the deck that I thought was going to be the winner. Like the deck that I have sort of identified with as like, these are my favorite decks. So I'm going to show you those decks. And then I'm going to show you the decks that I actually ended up choosing. And then we'll talk about that. We'll talk about why I think that was. So let's get started. Start with the Oracle decks. So if you've been watching my channel for a while, this Oracle deck that I'm going to show you is probably not a surprise. This is the Oracle deck that I thought was going to be the deck that I would choose. And so that is the Creatures Oracle. Reason why I thought I was going to choose this deck, and this deck was definitely one of the choices. It was in the 10 decks that went through and had the same chance that every other deck did. But the reason that I thought that this deck was going to be the deck that I choose is because for a long time, this has been what I have called my favorite Oracle deck. I love how the keywords on this deck are sort of on a spectrum. There are some positives, there are some more negative, there are some neutral cards. So it works for a lot of different situations. I love that the keywords are very well done on this deck, and they are very clear. But then also with this particular version that I chose of the Creatures Oracle, the guidebook has a slightly longer guidebook entry and it has more cards, which is another thing that I talked about. For an Oracle deck, I'd like to have one that has a lot of cards and has a lot of, is very relevant to a lot of different situations. Another great thing about this deck is these are creatures, so they're gender neutral, so it can be applicable to a lot of different people. And I love the colors and the textures of this deck. It's just great. But at the end of the day, even though I thought that this was going to be the deck that would win, when it came up against the other deck, I just realized that as much as I love this deck, I would be really sad not to have the other one, the one that I actually chose. And so even though that this is a great deck, it didn't quite have it wasn't quite, like, it just couldn't stand up to it. I will say, you know, for more of a practical reasons, the art on this is pretty simple. And so this was a point that Jay brought up in their video, is that, you know, it's going to be art that you're going to be looking at. It would be art that you were looking at for the rest of your life. And so, you know, this art is a little bit simple. But honestly, at the end of the day, the reason that I didn't choose this one is because when I was thinking about it, the other one is just the one that I wanted to keep more. Okay, so what is the oracle deck that I actually ended up choosing? And the answer is the Arboretum Oracle. This is a deck that I absolutely love. It is by Phil and Jackie Lovesey. They've done a number of different oracle decks in this universe, and but I will say I think that this is my favorite one of the ones in this universe. It was also the first one of theirs that I got. I think maybe White Hair Witch was first. No, I think it was this one. And so part of the reason why I think that this one won first is because there are a lot of cards that just like really mean a lot to me in this deck. And so like this card about acceptance, and just, you know, the story related to this card is really beautiful because it connects to, you know, even though someone might look scary or act differently, you should accept them for who they are, and that's okay if they're a little bit different. And so this card is really powerful to me, and that is true of a lot of different cards in this deck. I have had this oracle deck has been very important to me at certain situations, and the card that it's given has just been the exact right card that I needed in the moment. And so I think that that is part of the reason why, even though this deck doesn't necessarily follow any of the things that I just told you logically are reasons why to have this deck, you know, it's only 44 cards. The art is beautiful, but it's not like overly complex art, you know, if you're looking at this deck for the rest of your life. And so logically, this is not the deck that I would have chosen. But at the end of the day, when I was pitting decks up against each other, this is the one that I wanted. And like this card right here, this is another really beautiful card that really focuses on, it's not wrong to feel your emotions, and sometimes that needs to be part of your process. And so, yeah, that's a beautiful card. I love it. I've definitely gotten that card when I've needed to hear that message. And so it's just, I love this deck. And the stories are great. I guess I should say, you know, the way that this deck works is for each of these cards, there's kind of like a mini story that goes along with the card. And then there's sort of like a takeaway from that story. And it just, this deck is really powerful, and I really love it. And so, you know, I have used this deck a lot. I often will pull a card from one of my Matlock's decks before bed. So it's almost like a bedtime story, but, you know, just in general, I really love this deck. And even though logically it maybe wasn't the right choice, when I was really making myself choose between different decks, this is the one that I chose because, you know, this is just a great deck, and I would love having it, and it works really well for a lot of different situations. And so yeah, this is my choice. So now we're gonna move on to tarot. And the first thing I'll say is that the deck that I thought I was gonna choose is another one that for a while I've been saying this is my favorite tarot deck. You know, I love this deck. This was in on the, you know, 10 initial decks that I chose, and then it was the one that I thought would win. And so that is the Cosmovisions Oracle. Oops, it's upside down. The Cosmovisions Oracle. So You know, I called it an oracle because that's technically what it is, but I treat this like a tarot deck because it has 78 cards. The cards have a basically a connection to tarot, so I consider this a tarot deck. But for a long time, I have thought that this is like my favorite tarot deck. I really love Impressionism art style as an art style, and so this feels very impressionist, which I think is good. It feels very, I love the colors in it. It does, you know, each of the seasons, like the swords or the air suit has kind of a wintry feel, so you do get a little bit of that seasonality that I was talking about in this deck. I love that the wand suit is trees. Is the wand suit trees or is pentacles trees? No, sorry, I was wrong. The pentacle suit is trees. But I still really like it. And this deck is just, it's a deck that I love. Whenever I use it, it is super, it just makes sense to me. And I love the sort of, that the majors are kind of behind the veil. And so this deck just, I think, has a lot of depth to it. And so, you know, it is very naturey. And so for a long time, you know, this has been the deck that I have thought is my absolute favorite deck. And coincidentally, this deck goes really well with the Creatures Oracle, the first Oracle that I showed you. So, yeah. This is just a great deck. And I love looking at the cards. One of the challenges of this deck is that the quartz are just a sort of a title like this. But I was also thinking about the fact that if this had been my only deck, you'd probably learn those pretty quickly. Yeah, so this is the one I thought would win. But when I pitted this one up against the deck that I actually chose, you know, as much as I loved this deck and as hard as it was for me to make that decision, this was not the deck that I would keep. And it was just the way I felt. I can't give you necessarily a good reason. It was just a feeling. Let's talk about the deck that is actually the deck I wanted. And this one really surprises me. I wouldn't have thought this. I knew I loved this deck. You know, I knew that this deck was important to me, but I didn't think about it as the deck that if I could only have one deck, it would be the one that I would choose. So the deck that I actually chose is the Forhaxa Tarot. This is such a beautiful deck. I love this deck. And it just, again, like a lot of the cards in this deck just sort of evoke feelings to me, for me. Like, just like, for example, this 10 of air, this idea of just like losing the wings. It just is so, it makes you feel that 10 of air energy of just like an awful ending. Like, I love the interpretations of this deck. And I love the way that this deck kind of makes me sort of feel the feelings that these cards are supposed to represent. It's just so good. Yeah. I don't know. It's so good. Like this 3 of Earth, this idea that the fairy is working with the animals to accomplish it. It's just so good. And like that Chariot card, this is one of my favorite Chariot cards in the whole wide world. And so I think that part of the reason why this deck is so important to me and would fit a lot of my goals is because, you know, one, it is a deck that is very nature focused. It's like fantastical nature, but it is nature. It does have very strong, you know, women portrayed in it. I mean, just look at this 2 of fire. She's ready to go out and do some stuff. And it also, you know, does kind of have a witchy feel. Like, even though these are definitely fairies, it has kind of a witchy feel to it. I like that there is age diversity in this deck as well. I don't know. I just, like, this 5 of Earth is so powerful. You know, are the things that actually something you need to be worried about, or are they, you know, is it just in your mind? Are you building it up, but it's actually, things are actually mostly okay? Like, it's just, a lot of these cards are so powerful to me. Another thing that is kind of interesting, oh, I love that 9 of Earth as well. It's so cozy, it's so sweet, feels a little Christmassy. One of the things that's interesting is this is another deck that kind of tells a story a little bit. It doesn't have like that final like lesson learned type thing that the Matlock deck had, but it does kind of tell a little bit of a story, and so apparently that's something I really like in decks. But yeah, just when it came down to it, this was the deck that I wanted to keep. It's so beautiful. There's so much stuff to look at. It's so foresty. I don't know. I really love this deck. Like that High Priestess card. Oh my gosh. And that's kind of interesting too, is like there is sort of like a dark side a little bit to this deck. So it does kind of give me that dark side feeling. Oh yeah. So this is like one of my absolute favorite in the whole wide world Sun cards. This idea of, you know, focusing on the happy, on the positive thing, that just really resonates with me for the Sun card. It's not like everything is amazingly happy and your life is completely perfect, but it is like shining a light on the things that are happy and good in your life. And so, yeah, this deck just gives me the feeling, all the feelings. So yeah, this is the deck I chose, or like this 3 of Air cards. Oh, it's a dark card. It is definitely a dark card, but I think that that's part of why I love this deck, is it does have a little bit of a dark side, but it also has a little bit of a woodsy, cozy side. Yeah, this is a beautiful Hierophant card of like learning from nature. I don't know. And like the knowledge that's passed through nature. I don't know. This is a good deck. These were the 2 decks that I ended up choosing as the decks that if I could only have 2 decks for the rest of my life, it would be these 2. They actually are not awful together, but I think, you know, thinking about it, both of these decks kind of fit into some of these categories that I talked about. You know, they're very cozy. This one is a little bit darker, a little bit creepier. They're both clearly connected to nature, which is something that's very important to me. This one is very much witchy. And, I mean, not very, very much witchy, but it's a little bit witchy, I would say. And clearly strong women who are doing a lot of badass things, I would say, happens in the Furhaxa. So these definitely do fit into the categories of some of the things that I value in decks. But at the end of the day, what I realized is it was all about feelings. It was all about how I felt when I was picking between the different decks. It was about a feeling. And beyond that, I will also say it was about how the decks made me feel. And the thing that both of these decks have in common is that the cards really make me feel things and really make me identify with what the card is trying to communicate, whether that's, you know, in this case, good or bad. Both of these cards evoke feelings in me. And so I think that at the end of the day, that is why these decks would be the ones that I would choose. Now, it was also kind of interesting in the process because there was a couple of decks that I was considering that like Tarot of the Guiding Muse is a deck that I love, and Oracle of the Living Spell was a deck that I loved. But when I was thinking about it and comparing it to these decks, because they were definitely one of the 10 contenders, one of the things that I noticed is I kind of realized in that process that I don't want a deck that focuses on the same character. So as much as I love the 2 different people that are in, you know, Tarot of the Guiding Muse and Oracle of the Living Spell, it was kind of the same person in all of the cards. And so that was something that I was kind of realizing, that if I only had one deck, I didn't really want it to be that. So there we have it. Those are, if I could only have 2 decks for the rest, 1 tarot, 1 oracle, those would be the 2 decks that I would choose. And I have to tell you, I was very surprised. I was not expecting these 2 decks. I knew I loved these 2 decks, but I didn't realize that these ones would be the ones that I would choose. And so this was kind of an agonizing, but also really fun process, because, you know, just pulling out my top 10 decks and then whittling them down, it was very clear to me how, you know, there are some that was like, oh yeah, I clearly like this deck better than that deck. But then there are other situations where I was like sitting there agonizing over which one of these 2 decks. But when I made myself choose, I was able to. Interesting enough, even though it was a little bit agonizing, I was able to. So what about you all? What if you could only have 1 tarot and 1 oracle deck for the rest of time? Which ones would you choose? It would be super curious to hear. So if you have a channel and you want to do a video response to Jay, I think that would be awesome. I will definitely check it out to try to see what your choices are. But if you don't have a channel and you still want to participate, I would love to hear in the comments, if you could only have 1 tarot and 1 oracle deck, what would they be and why? And lastly, of course, thank you so much for joining me. If you enjoyed this video, I would love it if you could hit the like button. If you are subscribed already, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you. If you are not subscribed and you're interested in tarot content, you might want to think about subscribing. I do 1 video a week focusing on tarot decks. I like to do VRs like the one today. I like to talk about my decks. I like to talk about my collection and how I think about collections. Sometimes I share new decks. Sometimes I share decks that I've had for a while that I love. But if you do hit the subscribe button, then you'll be notified when I put out another video. Thank you all for stopping by.